I was a professional musician, not earning very much bread, and I was given a job, or I was offered a job, by a guy who worked for EMI, a guy who worked for Parlophone. And I cycled along in my old naval greatcoat to see him. And it didn't seem to be too arduous a job, so I took it on. It was very badly paid, but it gave me sort of bread during the day while I played at nights. And so I took it. I thought it'd be a stopgap, like most things. This was 1950, and things were very primitive then, extremely primitive. But I got hooked on it. I thought it was great. It was a whole new world. I was very fortunate, of course, because at that time, the record business was very much in its infancy. And it was the beginning of the big rock revolution anyway. You know, the sounds of rock were beginning to happen in the States in the 50s. And recording studios were learning completely new techniques. There were bands, there were jazz bands like Humphrey Lyttelton and Johnny Dankworth and people like that. There were orchestras like Sidney Torch. I did a lot of classical music to start with. That was my real bent. I did all the London Baroque ensemble recordings of pretty remote classical people. I suppose the first excursion into anything like modern group stuff was Skiffle, when I did the Vipers. They were a great group, actually. They were kind of non-electric, modern-day characters, all guitar players. And, of course, it was Lonnie Donegan's heyday, and all the sort of folk music of the rip-and-roaring skiffle sound came forth. Wally Whiten was the leader of the Vipers skiffle group. He now does an awful lot of children's work on television. At the same time, I had my own sort of rock star in Jim Dale, who was then the sort of counter to Tommy Steele and Cliff Richard. But Jim went on to do comedian stuff, comic stuff. But all the people at that time were really just cardboard imitations of all the American big ones, the really good ones. And we didn't have anything frightfully original of our own at that time. Shirley Bassey came along much later. She came, in fact, she'd already made a few records with a lot of other people. And she was, like most artists from time to time, she wanted to change, and she came to me and said, would I record her? And I always admired her work. And I did a few records with her. I did I Who Have Nothing and Goldfinger, one or two others, which made quite a bit of noise. Well, I did an awful lot of work before, with Parlophone, before the big ones came along. I did an awful lot of comic work, people with Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan. It started off really with Peter Ustinov way back. And I seemed to specialise in that kind of thing. I did recordings with Flanders and Swan and all the Beyond the Fringe people, Dudley Moore and Peter Cook and Jonathan Miller. And that led on to other people like Bernard Cribbins and Charlie Drake and so on. And I got the undesired reputation of being the comics A&R man, which I didn't really seek, but it was thrust upon me. But fortunately, that's long forgotten. Well, along came the Four Boys, of course. I had a reputation, but I don't think it was a reputation of making rock records. I think they came to me because I was the last resort. Brian Epstein visited me one day. In fact, what he'd done, he'd gone along to the HMV shop in Oxford Street with a tape that the boys had made, and he wanted to get some discs cut in order to play them to people, me included. Because in those days, tape wasn't as prevalent as it is now, and most A&R people didn't have tape machines in their office anyway. So he decided to have a few discs cut, and the guy cutting the discs thought they were rather good, and rang up the head of EMI Publishing, who was on a floor above, a guy who's now dead, actually, Sid Coleman, who then rang me up and said, George, you might be interested in this, because I think it might be worth hearing. Do you mind if seeing this guy by the name of Brian Epstein? I said, wheel him along. So Brian Epstein walked into my office with this little disc and said he had this fabulous group that he wanted me to listen to. And I put the record on and listened to it. And I said, okay, they sound interesting. When can I see them? And he said, well, they're in Liverpool. I said, well, you'll have to bring them down, won't you? I said, if you like, I'll allocate an afternoon in the MI studios and I'll listen to them in the studios. It's no good listening to this little disc here, because in fact it was pretty awful. So they came down and they performed for me. And I immediately liked them. I thought they were great characters. I wasn't sure what to do with them, but I liked them. So I signed them up. I had a feeling they were going to be good in some way, but certainly they gave no sign at that time anyway of being such great writers. And in fact, my main problem when I started out was to try and find a good song for them. It really was. The first song they gave me, I didn't think very much of, but it was the best we could do. That was Love Me Do. And in fact, it only got to number 17. And I found another song which I thought was good for them, which Mitch Murray wrote. And I asked them to record it, and they did record it, but they didn't like doing it. They said they'd much rather have one of their own. I said, well, when you can write one as good as this, we'll do it. So we still recorded this song, and at the end of it, John Lennon came to me and said, look, we've got another number on the stockpile which we'd like you to consider, and will you hold on to this record and not release it until we church you? So they came back a little while later with Please Please Me. And of course I was knocked out with it. I said, great, right, record this right away. And we speeded it up a bit and changed it around a bit. And at the end of that session I said, super, I really think you've got your first number one here. And the song that they had recorded, which Mitch Murray wrote, which they didn't want to issue, was a song called How Do You Do It? And then I gave that to Jerry and the Pacemakers because the Beatles didn't want it. And that became their first number one too. So we were both right. Brian kept bringing me all the people that he knew in Liverpool, and it became embarrassing really because he said, you know, with you, Brian said, between George and myself, we'll conquer the world here. We'll have I'll give you all the acts, George, and you record them, which was all very well, but one still had to make all the records. I suppose I had the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Billy J. Kramer, Cilla Black, The Foremost, and then I sort of called a halt and I said, no more, Brian, take them somewhere else. Because in fact I was resisting it anyway. I even resisted Billy J. Kramer, but he became my number one too. During that year, I think that was 1963, once we got on the bandwagon, once Please Please Me was number one, a record that I'd made was number one for 33 weeks out of 52. So it was sort of, I had a kind of leapfrogging or other existence of a kind of relay race between one record and another. As soon as Beatles went down, then Jerry took over the number one spot. As soon as Jerry went down, then Cilla took over the number one spot. As soon as Cilla went down, Billy J. Kramer took over the number one spot. So on, it went on like that eternally. It was an incredibly hard-working year. It was an amazing year. I nearly killed myself that year. I was obviously looking back on it. It was fantastic and it was enormous fun, but terribly arduous. They've never said that I didn't produce Sgt. Pepper because that's nonsense, you know, because it was so obvious. If they'd been left to their own devices during Pepper would never have happened, ever, because they were high most of the time. No, in fact, what had happened with Pepper was that it became an astonishing success. It was, when we were making it, we were all very much aware that we were into something, and it was almost growing by itself. And when it was finally finished, I wondered whether we'd gone too far, but I was very pleased with it. I was very proud of it, and I thought it was really good. And when, of course, it did achieve some acclaim, it had a curious effect on me because there was a report in Time magazine, which was completely unsolicited, which suggested that I was the real éminence grise behind the Beatles, and I was the real puppet master dangling the strings, and the others were dancing to my tune, and that obviously Pepper was my creation, and the Beatles were just subsidiaries in the great game that I was playing. It was very flattering to me, very ego-making, strictly untrue, but there was nothing I could do about it, and it caused a great deal of friction with the boys who said, well, Christ, who was George Martin? Who really wrote these songs? Well, of course, I never claimed that ever, but I did claim to produce it. I knew that they liked smoking pot, but they always tried to keep it from me because they knew that I didn't approve. And I knew also that other things were happening which I wasn't aware of, you know, which I was only dimly aware of, and I didn't want to know because I didn't want to get involved in it. And I was also very aware that we needed control. We needed to get things tidy. You know, when you're working a very complicated session on 4-track, unless you have a very tidy mind, you can make an awful lot of mistakes. Now, for example, if you're doing a very complicated thing like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and you've only got 4 tracks to play with, you are continually dubbing down the original 4 track onto others, jumping 4 into 2 tracks, keeping them. And each time you do that, you fix your relationship of sounds. So that at the end of the day, when you've done about 4 of these jumps, and you've got something that is approaching a final master, if you've made a mistake 3 generations ago, there's nothing you can do about it. So you've got to be very clear in your mind what you're going to do. In a way, I was disappointed that the next album, in my opinion, wasn't as good. I thought we'd set a standard with that. What I really wanted to do from there on was to treat our rock work rather like a classical symphony. I wanted to integrate things. I wanted to get the boys thinking in symphonic terms. I wanted them to write songs that blended into each other, that actually had recurring themes, that even had canonic devices, one with the other, and which had snippets coming back, and treating it like a formal, full-scale work, where you had maybe a 30-minute length that was actually a cohesive whole. Paul dug this idea very much. John didn't. John was into just the sort of simple, basic rock song, which he was probably right for himself. And when eventually we got back to this kind of thinking, which was in Abbey Road, side 2 became something like that concept, which Paul and I worked very much on, and John left it severely alone. And John's contributions were mainly on the other side. He did contribute to the slow side on Abbey Road, but he didn't get involved in the actual tying together of it. The White Album was the disappointment I referred to. I wanted to pare that down and issue just one single album with the best stuff from it, but they insisted on putting down all the songs that they'd thought of while they were away in India. And some of the songs I thought were fairly trite. Some of them were very good, but I thought that if we distilled it, we could have had a really super album. But they insisted on having all the things done, and I didn't realise at the time, I learned afterwards, that there was a reason for that, not an artistic reason. It was partly because of the contractual deal with EMI, which was expressed not only in terms of years, but as an alternate in terms of titles recorded. So the sooner they got them out, the sooner they got rid of their existing deal. I didn't know that at the time. Once I left EMI, I signed the Beatles on an original deal, and that was it. They were all very young people who were suddenly jet-propelled into a world that was most fantastic. And so it's not surprising that they did what they did. I think it's quite surprising that we managed to keep them to stay together so long, and that there was so much success for so much time. I left EMI in 1965 and started a company with 3 other producers as a kind of partnership. And the basic idea was that we just wanted to be independent. We didn't want to be tied to a big company. We were terribly frustrated with the big company policies. And we were very happy. We didn't have much money, but we were very happy. And we were lucky because, to begin with, I was the main sort of famous person, if you like, working. But the deal we got out of EMI wasn't very good from a royalty point of view, but it was all right because there were such large numbers involved. But then one of the guys, the 3 other guys were John Burgess, Ron Richards, and Peter Sullivan. Now, John Burgess and Ron Richards were very good also. They had some pretty good groups. Ron Richards had the Hollies. He still has, in fact. John Burgess had people like Peter and Gordon, Adam Faith, Manfred Mann, a lot of people like that. Peter Sullivan was the guy who couldn't catch a cold, and he was really down. And then one day he came forth with Tom Jones, just out of the blue. And as a result of Tom Jones, Gordon Mills introduced him to Engelbert Humperdinck, and he had 2 really big artists. So in one way or another, Peter probably brought in more to our company than I did, or as much as anyway. So we were very lucky. And we didn't take too much out of the company. We just took our own salaries and ploughed everything back into the company. And we were able then to, with the money we were earning, to build our own studio, something we always wanted to do, something I very much wanted to do, because I worked in an awful lot of studios in London, and I've always found them to be lacking in some respect. You know, one studio was good for one thing, another wasn't good for another. And I just wanted a studio that I knew I'd be comfortable in. So we built Air Studios. Well, we've been open now for about 3.5 years. It took us 2 years to plan and build, a year to plan and a year to actually physically build. So I guess that was about 5.5 years ago. And it, like most things, it just grew and grew and grew. We've now got a very big complex there. We've got 4 actual control rooms, 3 studios, overdubbing room, film facilities, 24-track, pretty well everything you could think of in a recording studio. We have a jingle company in conjunction with an American friend of mine called Herman Adele. And we've also got publishing companies, and we've got a company in Scandinavia, in Sweden. And it's a small, a nice tight little empire. It's not too big that I don't know everyone involved. I've got about 55 people working for me. The Stackridge are a very interesting group because they're a very musical group. Sometimes I wonder whether they're too musical. You know, they've got sort of leanings towards all kind of classical work and bits of Gilbert and Sullivan coming in here and there. And they're also an unusual group to watch. They're funny as well, and they put their tongue in their cheek and they stomp around. They've got a tremendously hardcore following. I don't know if you've ever been to any of their concerts. They've got a group of characters who are avid fans, who love their work, and they always get tremendous turnout at their live concerts. But they're basically, the music within them is almost too good for their own performance. It's very good indeed. That's what attracted me to them in the first place. One of the things I'm enjoying at the moment is being able to do what I like. It's a great freedom, that. And so I'm able to pick and choose what I want to do. I'm right now just preparing to do an album with John McLaughlin, the Mahavishnu guy, who's coming over to record in our studios with the LSO. And this is a fairly major project because it's very big orchestral stuff and very difficult to do, but it's very challenging. John's a very interesting musician. He's been continually developing all the time, and his new Mahavishnu outfit is different from the old one. In fact, it still isn't completely coherent even now. He was talking about using a string quartet and a trumpet, as well as his own fine guitar and electric 12-string, bass and drums and keyboard. As you know, the old Mahavishnu, you had an electric violin, well, it was a 5-piece group, electric violin, keyboard, bass guitar, drums, and John himself on electric guitar. And it was a very good group, excellent, marvellous musicians, I guess.
You also recorded Sea Train.
Yeah, yes, I enjoyed working with them. They've disbanded now. There's only about 2 left, I think. One of the albums I made when I was doing Sea Train was probably the album I think is one of the best I've ever made, and I don't think anyone's ever heard of it. And it's very ironic. It's a group called The Winter Consort, and it was issued on Epic. I don't know if you can get hold of it, but it's a super album. It's an album. The musicians themselves are in that curious hinterland between rock and classical music and pop, and all very fine musicians. A weird instrumentational. I mean, there's soprano sax, oboe, doubling cor anglais, cello, Fender bass, drums, and a guy playing all sorts of instruments from tabla to African drums, Brazilian urdos, and a keyboard player who was a fantastic guitar player as well. I mean, he was a classical guitar player, rather like John Williams, and also a very good keyboard man.
Sounds an amazing combination.
It is, and I don't know whether they're still going, but it was an amazing combination, and it was a very good record. Of course, I did make an album with John Williams as well, where, you know, the classical guitar player, in which for the first time he played electric guitar.
Classics is really, it's still in your blood, isn't it? You still...
Well, it's music. You know, I think music's of all kinds, and I think to deny any one sort of music would be wrong.
No, I think that a lot of people, when they hear the name George Martin, immediately, I mean, it's synonymous with the Beatles, and therefore rock, and therefore Sgt. Pepper. But to know that your basics really come from the classics.
Well, if I weren't as I were, then I don't think you would have heard Eleanor Rigby the way you did. You see what I mean? That's the influence that you hear.
You're writing an autobiography, or
not really an autobiography. No, I'm writing a book which is a kind of textbook on recording, but it's made a bit lighter by being something of a memoir as well.
When do you think that will be out?
Oh, probably the end of the year, I think. Hope so, if I can get down to it. It takes a lot of writing.
Do you have a title?
Well, the title at the moment is called All You Need Is Ears. I don't know whether it'll stick at that or not.